Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the bit of a late start. We're having some technical difficulties, but I think we have it fixed. Welcome back to the second day of our gathering, Europe, Japan, and the United States in a Changing World. We got off to a terrific start last night with an excellent opening panel and a fascinating conversation with the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Kahl. I'm very excited for today, especially this panel. If you'll pardon the rather childish image, this all-star panel reminds me of the Marvel movies my daughter Olivia watches, which involve the Justice League, a group of superheroes who gather from around the world to fight evil and devise solutions to the world's problems. This group might be thought of as the Justice League for grand strategy. I could not imagine a smarter, more impressive group. There are few more impressive than today's chair, Dr. Alina Playakova. Alina is a brilliant sociologist who has written on subjects ranging from the European right to the challenges of emerging technology in the global order. She regularly appears in such little-known outlets as Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and The Atlantic. After impressive stops at the Atlantic Council and Brookings, Alina has transformed the Center for European Policy Analysis as their president and CEO. We are very lucky as well to have her teach an extremely popular class on Russia at SAIS. She's also one of the best analysts of the current unfolding tragedy in Ukraine. And I personally have learned an enormous amount from her and am grateful for her willingness to lead today's stellar group. Alina, thank you for leading us, and over to you.
Well, Professor Gavin Frang, thank you so much for inviting me to have the humble honor of chairing this incredible all-star panel. As you said, it's really a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to have what I think is going to be an incredibly fascinating and insightful discussion, because I know that the people we have joining us are absolutely brilliant, and I know that we will have more to talk about to fill far more than the time we have allotted. I'm Alina Playakova. I'm currently president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and also delighted to teach Allocation at SAIS, which is a big highlight of my life on a weekly basis. So really appreciate being here. And to start us off, a couple of framing remarks before we go to our exceptional panel. And I will introduce everyone briefly, though I could spend hours introducing every single person given their individual high-level accomplishments, but I will spare that to our very patient audience. But the reason we're all gathered here today, I think, should be very obvious. The war in Ukraine, Russia's renewed military aggression in Europe, the kind that we really haven't seen since the end of the Second World War, is not just a challenge or a crisis in the global order. I think this is really an upending event of what we have traditionally thought of, at least in our elite policy circles, as the international rules-based order. And to my mind, what happens in Ukraine, the consequences of that go far beyond Ukraine. They go far beyond Europe or even the transatlantic relationship. We've already seen the reverberations of the war span, of course, to Japan, to the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, the global South. The entire world is being affected about what's happening in Ukraine as we speak. And this war is far from being over. As we have this conversation today, of course, there is very active, very brutal fighting happening on the territory of Ukraine. There isn't a diplomatic resolution in sight as of today. So this situation could go on for a very long time, unfortunately. And I think while it's in a crisis moment, we tend to think in a matter of hours or even minutes. But I think it will behoove us as thinkers about the future of the world order to think in terms of more long-term strategic visions for where is this going to lead us. Is this a complete upending of the post-Cold War order? And if so, what comes next? And how should we now be thinking about either rebuilding or revising or completely reinventing the institutions that have led to relative peace and prosperity since the end of the Second World War, at least in the transatlantic space, and also for the most part in the Indo-Pacific space. For policymakers, many of whom are on this distinguished panel today, I think the big question facing those from the United States certainly is how do we now balance the long-term challenge of China and the military threat of Russia? Certainly when the Biden administration came into office, we had a very clear set of foreign policy priorities, and China was at the top of that list. Russia was not at the top of the list, but things have changed quite dramatically, to say the least. Of course, France has played a key role in European defense and security, in NATO and within the EU, has been advocating for more investment in European defense for several years under President Macron. But how will France balance its interests, particularly in the Sahel and the Middle East? What is Europe's role in its own defense and security going forward? We've seen some quite dramatic developments in countries like Germany on defense and security policy, but is this really going to stick for the long term, or is this just a crisis response? And of course, it's been fascinating to see the UK develop its own approach and really choosing the Russia threat, if you will, over the China threat in some ways. And we've seen the culmination of that thinking, that strategic thinking that was first laid out in the UK's integrated review, now really come to light. And we've seen the UK, I think, take a very assertive leadership role in supporting Ukraine, in leading on how we should be thinking about our responses. So these are all the issues that we'll be discussing today. And I'm so delighted to have with us, an absolutely stellar panel. We have with us to speak from the perspective of the United States, Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper, who is the Director for Indo-Pacific Strategy at the National Security Council. And she's responsible for the Biden-Harris administration strategic initiatives for the Indo-Pacific. Previously, Dr. Rapp-Hooper was a senior scholar at the Council on Foreign Relations. There's many other accolades. She's the author of several books that I recommend to everyone on this complex set of topics. I also have with us Justin Vacy, founder and director general of the Paris Peace Forum, which is an independent nonprofit organization created in 2018, of which he was in fact the founder at the request of the French president. Previous to that, Dr. Vacy was the director of policy planning at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs for over 6 years, and is also the author of several very interesting books, including one on Zbigniew Brzezinski. I think that's the most recent one. And last but certainly not least, we have joining with us today Professor John Bew, who is the foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and also professor at King's College London, where he's led a major project on in the Grand Strategy program. He was also a well-recognized scholar and was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for Politics International Studies. And he was also the youngest ever holder of the Henry A. Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy at the John Klug Center at the U.S. Library of Congress. So certainly we have an incredible group with us today. Mira, let me start with you first, if I can. I mentioned the role of the United States in the future of the global order, the kind of trade-offs we'll have to be thinking about, our desire to still engage in the Indo-Pacific, to look at how the long-term competition with China will affect U.S. leadership and presence in the world. But now, of course, we've had this very direct threat emerge in Europe. So how do we think about that challenge? How do we think about the balance that the U.S. will have to strike? Mira, over to you.
Well, Alina, thank you so much for the excellent question, for your kind introduction, and thank you so much to Frank and to the whole Kissinger Center team for inviting us today. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'll lay out as sort of the start of my response to Alina's great question, a caveat which I'm sure all of my colleagues on this panel will share, which is that while it feels like Russia's invasion of Ukraine has truly upended the international order, it's also worth reminding ourselves that we are only 1 month into this conflict. So while it feels like everything from European defense spending to Western alliance unity to the involvement and interest of Indo-Pacific allies represents a true sea change since Russia's invasion, we have to remind remind ourselves that we are looking at a snapshot in time of this first month, and the lessons learned, the trends we are identifying could look very different 6 months or 12 months from now, depending on how all of these forces continue to evolve and play out on the ground. That said, I think there are a few things that I would offer in response to Alina's question. The first, on the question of kind of how the Biden administration sees the relative prioritization of Russia and Europe versus China. While it is absolutely true that this invasion was not foreseen when we took office a little bit over a year ago, it is the case that I know the US government and many others have understood this Russia to be a possibility for some time. That is to say, we have understood Russia to be a power in decline that was nonetheless extremely dangerous on its way down. And in many ways, that is what we have seen play out on the ground in this last month, of course, with the caveat that things could evolve or change. And we nonetheless continue to see China as the most significant long-term great power competitor. So the way we fundamentally understand the relative strength and relative weighting of these two powers in the international system is in some ways consistent. But there are a few other things that I would observe when it comes to the connections between Europe and the Indo-Pacific that I think will be with us for a long time to come. The first is that in the immediate term, we have seen a set of responses from both European allies and Indo-Pacific allies that suggest very clearly that this war in Europe is not confined to Europe. And that is a fundamental change from conflicts that we have seen in the past. In just the first few weeks of conflict, and really in just the first few days, we saw unprecedented reactions to Vladimir Putin's invasion by allies in the Indo-Pacific, with really Japan in the lead in a number of ways, but also incredibly robust responses from the Republic of Korea, from Australia, and even from Singapore, which may have been less expected, ranging from strenuous sanctions to rigorous export controls to unequivocal statements of repudiation, and in some cases to providing lethal or non-lethal aid to the Ukrainians. And it's important to identify just how much of a sea change this is for many of our Indo-Pacific allies. In the case of close allies like Japan, it has already come at a cost. Japan has a long-standing territorial dispute with Russia, which it has been trying to negotiate, and the Russians have now sort of cut off the path to those negotiations as a cost for Japan's strong position. But those allied positions have been unwavering. And they will be critical to ensuring that both Russia and China continue to learn the lessons that they have learned in this first month, which is that there is an incredible amount of alliance unity between regions, and not just in the transatlantic alliance in response to Russia's invasion. The second factor that I will flag, which I know we'll dig into over the course of the conversation, is the fact that we've now seen evidence of some real Sino-Russian alignment in this conflict that is very concerning, obviously to the United States and to many other governments, but also has the potential to galvanize allies in a way that would not be possible, frankly, without it. That is to say, we've seen reported publicly the fact of potential military aid and economic aid from China to Russia. And this not only changes the ways that European allies think about China, but it changes the ways that Indo-Pacific allies think about Russia. We have any number of allies in the Indo-Pacific who have, in some ways, continued to think of Russia as a hedge against China, have close defense or security relations with Russia. But now knowing what we do about the fact that there has been considerable alignment between these two powers as Russia has launched its invasion, we will see how those positions evolve going forward. So again, I would wrap up this comment on the note I started. It's really too soon to tell what forces will be with us a year or two from now. But already in this first month, we do see this extraordinary galvanizing of the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific alliance systems in ways that I believe will be with us for a long time to come.
Well, thank you so much, Mira. That was a real tour de force, and you put a lot on the table for us to follow up on. I think this is a really natural transition to Justin. And Mira really talked about how we now have this transatlantic unity, but not just transatlantic unity, but unity really across the globe when it comes to upholding international rules and laws, and also condemning Russia for its actions. And of course, we've seen Japan step up in a really significant way, especially on the sanctions front. But how does France now see itself in this balancing act that we're going through in terms of the direct military threat that France also faces because of Russia? I mean, it is a broader threat to European security. And then, of course, the long-term threat of China. And how do you see the short, medium, and long-term consequences of what's happening today playing out for Europe's role in the world, but also France's role in Europe and the role more broadly? Justin?
Alina, I think the key word is unity. I think what President Macron has been trying to do is to make sure that unity, which is probably our best asset in the face of such wide-ranging sort of questioning of the international rules that really sustain the international order. So unity, first, I would say NATO unity, military unity, reinforcement of capacities in the Baltic states, in Romania, sent by France, but also unity on sanctions. And we know that sanctions will not be sustained if they exact a toll on those who decide them. That is too important. So it's a balancing act. These sanctions are like the ones we've never seen before, but they need to be sustainable. I'm thinking of fuel prices, for example, which have a big effect on public opinion. I would say also unity of the EU. That's really important. You know that France is chairing the Council of the European Union this semester. And so it's really important to keep the EU united. The bulk of the sanctions indeed comes from the EU. The international community is next, and I'm thinking of the what has been done at the UN, the vote just yesterday on the humanitarian resolution that was sponsored by France and Mexico, and that basically got the same number of votes as the previous one of March 2, that is 140 votes in favor. But then last, but probably not least, and that's where I would slightly differ with your assessment in your question, unity of the entire international community. And here, it's a bit more blurred, not only because if you look at the numbers of the resolutions voted, 140, 141 out of 193, that looks very good on paper. But obviously, if you look at the demographics behind this, that is the number of people concerned, if you add China and India and others, you get close to half of the world population that, through the voice of their UN ambassador, has abstained or voted no on the two resolutions. And more generally, I think we should not underestimate, and that's a hint for the world order to come after, the extent to which the rejection of the West in many parts. I was in Africa just 2 weeks ago. You know that Senegal, for example, abstained on the resolution, and that was sort of an alarm bell that rang. Whether that will improve or that will degrade, and we should not underestimate the economic blow that will follow, not only from the war, but also from the sanctions that we collectively, and for good reason, are taking on Russia, because these sanctions will actually inflict more economic pain all around, including on fuel prices, on food supplies, etc., than the war itself. And that's why one of the initiatives taken by the EU and the AU, President Macron announced it yesterday, is the FARM initiative. It's called Food and Agriculture Resilience Mission, in order to try to soften the blow on food supplies by releasing stock, preventing export, blocking, raising production, etc. I think we should really pay attention to what the rest of the world is thinking behind the good numbers that we had at the UN.
Well, thank you, Justin. I think I'll be following up with you and then the rest of you on kind of the long-term vision here, but that was a really interesting update. And I think you bring up this broader question of how should we thinking about this question of unity, and what is that once we go below the surface of that, the situation looks a little more perhaps fragmented than it looks initially. I think my question, that I'll come back to all of you on, is also about, yes, we have unity, especially on the sanctions side at the moment, but is this something that you think we'll be able, as a community of democracy, as an international community, as a transatlantic community, to channel that into other avenues to have comprehensive union, other policy, including China, which we haven't actually had among the transatlantic allies. There's been a very divisive issue for a very long time. So John, let me take it over to you. I was mentioning in the beginning, I alluded to the integrated review that the UK put out that prioritized Russia as the threat to Europe. And I think obviously since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that looks like a very prescient document. Of course, China was also part of the integrated review and thinking about the Indo-Pacific. We haven't mentioned AUKUS, but I know it's still perhaps a divisive issue, but that was an important initiative for investment into the Indo-Pacific security from the UK, Australia, and the United States. So let me take it over to you. Now that we have this active military war in Europe that's being felt, I think, quite viscerally in the UK and France and other places on the continent. The UK is, of course, part of NATO, not part of the EU, as everyone knows. What is the role of the UK now? And how has the strategy that was outlined in the integrated review being enacted today? Just give us your sense of the current dynamics.
Well, thank you, Alina. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Well, it's good to see friends and colleagues, including some who I've seen very recently, like Justin, and full marks to Mira for finding a nicer room than I managed to find. Not only was the Wi-Fi not working in the stateroom I booked, I've also, my poor colleagues behind me have to listen to me as well for the next few minutes. So a spare thought for them, and on that grounds I'll be brief. So thank you, Frank. Thank you, Alina, for assembling a very stellar cast list. It's a genuine pleasure to be part of it. I think it, striking. There's a mixture of policymakers and people from the academic or think tank community on this call, and it really does strike me. It has been a period of heightened intellectual activity, actually, in the policymaking space. We have had in the UK a lot of sort of different groups of experts on different subjects in various moments in time to give us a kind of new perspective, to challenge some of our assumptions, and also to sort of dig into some old concepts that, frankly, that were all in our kind of intellectual armory, but needed a bit of a refresh. And, we've had many conversations on deterrence. I was exchanging some messages on this last night with Frank, in which I said, we're in a situation where the British Prime Minister was yesterday talking about deterrence by denial. Actually quite dusty old academic concepts that need to be, looked at and assessed again. So I think that's important. I know we've also been sharing essays from the academic community among very senior policymakers. So, we are kind of in search of these ideas, and I think these dialogues are more important than ever before. And in fact, even our Defence Secretary has wrote an essay to broad, although not unanimous, acclaim in response to some of the historical thesis put forward by President Putin, that sort of the sort of pre-justification of what he did, which went back into some history. So, we are in a period of contending narratives and theories and interpretations. And as I've said to a few of you on this group, to sit around senior policymakers and have debates about what was actually said at key moments of NATO expansion is pretty significant. So a bad time for all of us, but also an important moment for those of us who traverse these two worlds. Secondly, at a very simple level, it's been a clarifying moment. I think it's been a clarifying moment for those countries you might broadly include, and I think and Alina made this point and Mira made this point. I think sort of Western alliance is not the right phrase at all, actually, and I noticed yesterday in NATO people kept on slipping back to it. There's a broad kind of alliance community of democracies, and for that community of democracies, what has happened has been a clarifying moment. And if you think back to sort of June last year, when there were tentative conversations on strategic stability, we've all been asking ourselves in different forms for many years as to whether we could rethink or stabilize the sort of security architecture of Europe. But the reason why it's a clarifying moment is what has happened is the violation of the most simple, basic rule of international relations of the last 100 years, that nations have the right to choose their future. particularly when they have democratically elected governments, and they have the right to defend themselves. So that sort of core principle is inviolate, and that is why it's a clarifying moment. So the UK, we've had conversations. We had a conversation. Our Prime Minister spoke to Xi Jinping this morning. We had a conversation earlier in the week with Prime Minister Modi. We had a very interesting bilateral yesterday with Japan on the fringes of the G7. Everyone is coming back to that core fundamental principle in the UN Charter, and that's why there's a clarifying moment, and that's why there's no sort of all the illusionary sort of narratives that have led up to this point have been really exploded by what you've seen and the nature of their action. So it is a clarifying moment. It's been a clarifying moment for the UK as well. Very simply, and Justin kind of alluded to it. We all have different economic equities affected in different types of way, but it's the first sort of major test of European security post Brexit, and the UK's played an active role. I will say no more than that. It's been consumed a lot of senior leader level energy, as it should, and it underscores the UK's fundamental commitment to Euro-Atlantic security. So in my view, it is an inflection point. I know that some people, and President Biden was very clear in this yesterday, I think it is a real inflection point, and it's not a 2014 moment, and it's not a 2008 moment. And one thing our Prime Minister has been very eager to insist, and put this in an article he wrote in the New York Times a few weeks ago, is therefore there can't be sort of creeping normalization off the back of it, both for what that would mean in terms of implications for Ukraine itself, but also what that would mean in terms of the erosion of any sort of semblance of a structured, rules-based, whatever you want to call it, international order. There cannot be that creeping normalization. I don't think there will, actually, such as the gravity. To have a situation where NATO was yesterday discussing the possibility of chemical and biological weapons being used on the European continent in cities we have all visited and we are familiar with, it just demonstrates how significant this moment has been. And again, what our Prime Minister said yesterday, both in the NATO summit, but also publicly, is from our perspective, red lines have already been crossed. Major red lines have already been crossed. The fact of the way the Putin campaign is shifting now from this, what was expected rather arrogantly as a kind of lightning war, a demonstration of Russian military virility, to a kind of grinding Groznification campaign. We've seen that what's happening in Mariupol and elsewhere means that red lines are being crossed every day, frankly, and that's sort of where we are, and we don't want to kind of create new ones or create new bars to leap. Our response is basically it's got to be in the moment and the now. So I just make those points, and I'll just make two more off the back of them. Alina, you're very kind about the prescience of the integrated review. I think, let's be frank, all of us in this community and elsewhere are all undergoing a certain level of strategic shock. We did say a number of things in that integrated review, so that it identified Russia as the most acute threat to European security, and we increased defence spending. I think it was to 2.3% at the time, the biggest shift since the end of the Cold War. And also we changed some of our language around our nuclear posture, including an increase in the warhead cap. Those are the kind of controversial things we did at the time. Now, they are not controversial anymore in any respect in UK politics, but even then, I think what has also been clear is the kind of the deterrence posture that underlay that approach has also been shaken by what we've seen in Ukraine. We've got to rethink and reinforce that. So we're all engaged in this sort of period of strategic shock, and let's be honest about it. But also the other things we said in the integrated review, I think, are more true rather than less true, which it is in particular UK's interest, and it was our identified interest to be more engaged in the Pacific. Now, there's always a kind of a bit of this is always welcomed in DC think tank lang, but it was sort of responded to differently in the European context or in the London debate, which is, well, that means you're flouncing off out of the European Union to different parts of the world in a sulk. And it was never supposed to be that, which is why we had this strong Euro-Atlantic focus as the kind of bedrock of all our shared security, and that's been underscored by what's happened. But we don't think it is any less important to engage in the Indo-Pacific. We think when appropriate, the ugly child of AUKUS has to leave the attic, and we need to get on with propositions like that. We want to deepen those ties. We've got a strong emphasis, particularly on the India relationship. We've got a strong emphasis on where we can go further with Japan as well. So I think those things are as important. Also, the things we talked about in terms of defense and security and the importance of science and technology within that. I mean, that really, to my mind, is the kind of the thing that runs through the integrated review. It's science and technology and new capabilities. I also think the battle space is demonstrating some of that as well. And just finish with one point on Ukraine itself. So, we can pat ourselves on our back for unity, and I think that's just right and proper. But the real thing that both the sort of intellectual, ideological, and also the geopolitical fact has been created by the fact and the extent and the effectiveness of Ukrainian resistance. I think if you go back just over a month ago, there was only a very small number of countries in this broad alliance sending lethal defensive weaponry to Ukraine, and UK made that decision last year. The US, of course, has done this for many years. There have been training under Operation Orbital, for example, which Canada has played a significant role going back to 2014. What's become clear over the course of the last month is that those were not symbolic acts of solidarity. When combined with the extent of Ukraine's resistance and that clear sense of identity, they have changed the battle space and they've created a new geopolitical fact, which is that we're not preparing for a sort of long-term grinding resistance against a sort of flash Russian invasion. What's going on here is a war of national defense by European democracy. And that geopolitical fact, I think, is something we're sort of getting our heads around at the moment. And I think it's therefore incumbent for us at this moment to double down in support of Ukraine, both in terms of the sanctions. I think that's identifying where you can squeeze the loopholes or tackle the kind of the different equities and different systems. But secondly, providing that defensive support for Ukraine. And that I think is where our kind of immediate effort and focus is. But I'll pause there, and again, thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, John, and everyone. I also want to note that we have a really fantastic group of panelists from this conference and in the Zoom today. Hal Brands, Marina Henke, Phil Zelikow, Nabe Watambe, as well as Professor Toshihiro Nakayama. I want to encourage all of you, if you have a question, I think you should be able to raise your hand and come into the conversation, make comments, share your observations as well. But before we get there, I want to take one quick opportunity as the prerogative of the chair here to say a couple of words in response to what all of you have said. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. About Ukraine, because we're obviously talking about Ukraine, but we don't have representation of the Ukrainian perspective here on the panel. And while I don't necessarily think of myself in those terms, I usually speak from a US policy perspective, but I'll put on that hat for the time being and just say a couple of words about, I think, where Ukrainian thinking is on this from policy perspective and what the view has been towards the kind of assistance and support that the Ukrainians have been receiving from Europe, the United States, and other allies, as well as what the Russian approach is likely going to be. And I think we're getting a lot more clarity on that. And I think, John, this comment you made about the sort of Groznification of this war, I think is actually very much on point. But there's also some profound differences, which you spoke to, between the Chechen strategy we saw the Russians develop in the 1990s, or even the Syria Aleppo strategy that we saw in 2015. Because Ukraine is a profoundly different theater. For the reasons you mentioned, the well-trained military, the constant flow of weapons supplies from friendly countries, as well as just the sheer size of the country and the kind of resistance we're seeing from civilians on the ground. So that's all of those three factors present, I think, a very new battlefield for the Russian military. And we've seen how they actually have not been able to so far achieve what we thought were their objectives, which is a very quick sweep and takeover within a matter of days or a week, which is of course what they did in Chechnya in the second war in Chechnya. Complete capitulation of the capital. They're nowhere close to that right now. So I think the Russian forces are also struggling, and I think we're also seeing some clarifying moments, if you will, about Russian capacities and capabilities. That even though on paper they have an incredibly powerful military, in practice when it's put to the test, it's not performing at the level that we would have expected. So just a couple of thoughts, and then I want to go back to all of you with really a more broader set of questions, and I'll bring our audience into the discussion as well. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, what I hear a lot when I talk to Ukrainian colleagues and counterparts is, on the one hand, the reality that despite the assistance that Ukraine is receiving and the weapons, which is much appreciated, there is still, now we're in this kind of situation where Western allies, if you will, or the ones that are supplying security assistance, are in this moment of hand-wringing, if you will, where we're calibrating every little policy decision, every type of security assistance, still from the perspective of whether this will provoke Russia. And of course, Russia, I mean, what does that really mean? And of course, the Russians have been using the nuclear threat, they've been using chemical weapons threat. But at the end of the day, the Russian approach here will be determined by their own strategic thinking, their own tactical assessments, not if we send fighter jets versus missile defense systems to Ukraine. We've seen this pattern over and over again. And I think there's been this fear from Europe, from the United States, of using this moment, which I 100% agree with how you characterized it, John, as a clarifying moment and a moment of strategic shock, to take advantage of, to change the pattern that we've been in with our policy vis-a-vis Russia for many, many decades at this point, where we're still reacting to Russian actions versus setting the agenda. And in the beginning of this conflict, the United States in particular laid out, we set our own red lines, which I think has not been particularly strategically productive. And I think we're trying to change that now. But the reality is that I think from the Kremlin side, when they hear no boots on the ground, no NATO activities on the ground in Ukraine, they hear it's fair game. And they're following through on that. I mean, the kind of destruction was seen in Mariupol, they were likely to see in many other Ukrainian cities. The kind of consequences that has in terms of refugee flows into Europe is so significant. And I think the question I ask myself sometimes, the Ukrainians are asking themselves as well, is how much more pain are we willing to watch happen before we take this moment to change the pattern we've been in? Because that's how the Ukrainians are thinking of it. They think they can change Russia's playbook. They think that because Ukraine is different than Chechnya, because it is different than Syria, they can reverse or at least put a huge damper into how Russia has led this war and how it's led wars in the past. And I really think it would be in our interest to start thinking about how do we use this moment to change the dynamics, to change the strategic dynamics for the long term. Because very quickly from the Russian perspective, what we've seen as a pattern of foreign policy and security policy from the Russian side is, first and foremost, they can find any excuse to do whatever they want. You know, if they want an excuse to say NATO is already involved on the ground in Ukraine, they have it, frankly. You know, it's American weapons, European weapons that are being used to kill Russian soldiers. So if they wanted to make that as an excuse to escalate, they could. So to my mind, that means actually opens a lot of doors and opportunities for us to do more. And so I think we're still stuck in this kind of paralysis mode where we don't have a strategic vision for what we actually want to do vis-a-vis Russia as an alliance and as a global community. And I think we have to really work together, not just to fall into a kind of status quo. We provide weapons, Ukrainians fight, we support them. This war goes on for years, potentially. And then we have some sort of negative outcome that we didn't want to see. I think we have a lot more control over the outcome than we think. And I think there's actually a chance that Russia will lose this war. And I think we have to think in those terms. We have to think in terms of victory, which is how the Ukrainians think. So that's my 2 cents to add here from the Ukrainian perspective. But I wanted to turn it back over to all of you, because I think the interesting question that Mira, that you alluded to, and all of you have spoken to in some way in your comments, has to do with the approach to Russia and China in tandem. And Mira, if I can take it back to you, because I think my main question, I'm sure is in other people's minds as well, is can the US do both? You know, we obviously have the national security strategy and defense strategy that's going to come out from this administration at some point. the entire US government apparatus has for several years now shifted away from Europe, you could say, and under several administrations towards the Indo-Pacific and towards China. But is there now a broader realization that we can't choose one over the other, and that we're going to have to do both? And what does that really mean in terms of our resources, our abilities, our strategic perspective? And I'm going to ask a similar question to you, Justin and John, and then I'll go over to our audience.
Thanks, Alina. I think my bottom line answer to your question is that we have no choice but to do both. It will be very difficult, but it is unquestionably the mandate here. While you're absolutely right that the US government has been shifting towards a world in which we see China and our position in the Indo-Pacific as our sort of critical theater. John is exactly right to identify this as a strategic shock, which has made very clear, if it wasn't already clear, which I think it was fairly clear, that we're going to be deeply involved in European security for a very long time to come, including this war in Ukraine, which, despite I think your good warnings, Alina, I do believe will drag on for quite a while and will take all of our government's attention in significant ways for a significant period of time. That said, I think we are well acquainted with the fact that we have no choice but to focus on China as the kind of long-term pacing challenge, because it has been for a very long time. And if this conflict has taught us anything, it's that we cannot divorce the China challenge from what is currently happening in Europe, by way of what has been publicly reported in terms of China's potential support for Russia in this conflict. So this introduces to us a couple of key challenges. On one level, from a grand strategic perspective, one can absolutely say that Russia is the immediate challenge and threat, obviously, to Europe, to Ukraine, but also to Europe more broadly, whereas China remains the kind of medium and long-term challenge, both in Asia and globally. But the reality on the ground is that to the extent that the two are linked, we can't decouple them temporarily, and we can't kind of put China and the Indo-Pacific on pause for the sake of focusing on Europe. So that what that means is, of course, as I already indicated, that we have to do both. And I think the only way that we can do both is if we are all doing both, if it's not just the United States doing both. That, of course, recalls John's comments about the UK's integrated review and Indo-Pacific tilt, the importance of seeing the United Kingdom and the European Union increasingly involved in the Indo-Pacific, as both have pledged to be, and as the EU in particular is moving out on through France's presidency right now and through the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. It also means that we need to ask allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to step up in fairly unprecedented and newly cooperative ways, both inside the region, in addition to sustaining their attention and their focus on the conflict in Ukraine. But it also will necessarily come with some challenges for the United States. I can say, frankly, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, that the hardest piece of this will be resourcing. In a year where we are kind of leveraging unprecedented levels of security assistance and other forms of assistance to Ukraine, and in which we have just published a new Indo-Pacific strategy that envisions new resources to the Indo-Pacific, it will be incredibly difficult to advance both tasks at once. But I think, the straight answer is that all we can do is our absolute best. In the US, at least, we have a remarkable amount of bipartisan support, given how little bipartisan support we have for most things, to keep our eye on the ball in Asia, as well as to continue our support for Ukraine. So we will do our absolute best to push both sets of strategies, both sort of preparatory mechanisms forward, but we will only be able to do so if we are seeing allies continue to step up and lead in both regions.
Well, thank you, Mira. And Justin, let me follow up with you, because I think what Mira said inevitably alludes to trade-offs that we're all going to have to make in terms of resourcing away from some things and towards other things. This also means taking some pain. And I think this is felt very profoundly in Europe, of course, with European dependence still on Russian energy. I know that is a big part of the conversation. There were some announcements just recently about increased US LNG exports to Europe, but that will not immediately, can't go through an energy transition overnight. We all understand that. But certainly there are some significant pain the Europeans will have to take, but also the governments will have to think through. What are the trade-offs here? And the question I want to pose to you, just because President Macron has been so vocal over the years about two issues, and that's investment in European defense, and two, this idea that we need to somehow still integrate Russia into Europe's security architecture. That was, of course, before the war, but at the same time, President Macron has been leading a separate diplomatic effort to try to engage Putin. So far, that hasn't led to seemingly progress on the diplomatic front. So can you help us square the two, and where is France today, especially when it comes to this balance that Mira is also talking about, that we started the conversation with, and how is the vision changing, perhaps because of what's happening in Ukraine?
Obviously, there's a similar dilemma that the one that Mira described in terms of allocating resources, and we can't really afford to not do a few things. So first of all, obviously, everybody was wrong-footed. We all thought that we would be concentrating on China and the Indo-Pacific come 2021 and 2022. Everybody was looking at that. France has had an Indo-Pacific strategy for a number of years. The EU adopted one just last year. France has been present in the Pacific through its territories, its population, its navy, etc., for a long time. And the idea was to increase that thanks to the decrease of tensions on the European continent. Well, that did not come to pass, obviously. And so, yes, there will be an increased tension on resources, and that is true, I think, also of the EU. I do not think that the Indo-Pacific focus will be forgotten or pushed aside. I think it will be kept, and I think we can do several things at the same time. But obviously, the focus and the attention now is there. Now, there are also other balances of power or other security situations that need to be tended to, and I'm thinking of the Sahel and the situation in Africa, where we have thousands of troops and an operation, military operation going on, and it's difficult, and it's been going on for a number of years. But as we see in Mali, the danger is that simply withdrawing would leave the space to the jihadists and would destabilize the whole of Western Africa, which obviously no one would benefit from. And that's where we get back to Russia, because obviously Russia, with very limited but well-targeted means, such as means of disinformation, fake news, etc., on the one hand, and mercenaries from the Wagner group on the other hand, whether it's in Central African Republic or in Mali, has been, of course, making progress. And I think there was no illusion on the part of President Macron that these tools were used, but that he thought that a European security architecture could still be at hand. And so one of the difficulties will be allocating resources to the Indo-Pacific, to Africa, because the operation is not going to end, and of course to the European theater and NATO. And obviously there will be a revision of priorities. I don't think, however, that neither of the three will be completely abandoned. Rather, we're looking, I think, at a global increase of resources devoted to these objectives.
Thank you, Justin. And John, over to you for the same set of questions. One thing I've noticed, and I don't know where this actually stands right now, though I assume it's in a very different place, that there were conversations prior to the war, not just in the United States, but I think also in some circles in Europe, that we should be thinking about how we decouple Russia and China from each other, right? How do we try to pull Russia away so we can really focus on China without having to really deal with that bilateral relationship becoming stronger and stronger? Obviously, I think that has been completely upended based on where we are today. So again, now are we really thinking about the dyad, right? Because the Russia-China relationship, I think, presents a different challenge than just Russia on its own or China on its own. And then, so if you want to respond to anything that Justin and Mira laid out about how France and the US are seeing the different priority challenges ahead from a resource perspective as well. And where does the UK stand on that? I think I know based on your previous comments, but would love to hear you elaborate a little bit more. And if you want to take us into a broader kind of thinking about, what can we start thinking about what the world is going to look like? Now, I wouldn't say post-war, because we don't know when that's going to be, but as a result of this war.
Thanks, Lena. I mean, I think the challenge with the sort of the wedge drive thesis or whatever it was called is quite a difficult thing to say and do. Easy thing to say, sorry, difficult thing to do. And again, I think back to President Biden's conversations in June last year. He was cautious about sort of pushing that sort of line of argument too hard. And if you just sort of take the UK's assessment of both these challenges, really over the course of the last 2.5 years, on a range of issues from Hong Kong through to Huawei, through to Xinjiang, UK's position on China. I don't think it's any surprise that anyone here has hardened considerably. That does not mean it sort of follows exactly the position of other countries, and why would it? The Prime Minister spoke to Xi Jinping for quite a long time this morning. So that one thing happened, and then simultaneously vis-a-vis Russia, I think it's sort of worst fears confirmed. So if I'm sad to say that the sort of bleak version of this is as described in the integrated review, is that we basically think that on a range of issues, and it's particularly found in the technological space, but also in the space in the trading space, in terms of the macroeconomic space, in terms of the battle for critical minerals, that sort of divide between the community of democratic countries and those of an authoritarian posture, particularly tied to the Eurasian landmass, is just getting more profound. I think that's a sort of basic depressing starting point. But just two quick words on one quick word on unity. That's a complex thing too. I mean, one of my observations in terms of what's happening in European politics is the European geopolitics is back in play in some respects. There are a lot of sort of shifting alliances, groupings. There is a more forward-leaning grouping in the European continent. It was quite profoundly, clear from the NATO discussion yesterday. Some of those who feel the threat or the challenge more acutely, and they've been saying, Russia's the threat for many years. It's what the kind of worst fears confirmed from Polish friends and the Baltic states as well. So that's a sense of profound threat is there already. So, unity needn't be unanimity, and let's not sort of dress it up too much in that respect. There are different tensions around where the emphasis is on sanctions. So the UK had a blind spot or a weak spot going back many years on illicit finance and oligarchs. There's a whole set of designations yesterday. Because of the nature of our property laws, it took longer to kind of flush that out, but we had a lot of criticism early in the crisis. I think there was another 66 designations on the back of yesterday. And Europe has a more severe critical vulnerability when it comes to Russian oil or Russian hydrocarbons. And again, even more complicatedly, that dependency is actually, in some cases, most profound in areas that have the most greatest threat from Russian military force as well. So in the eastern flank. So it's a complex picture, and some of those arguments are necessary to flush out and have. Otherwise, you've got a kind of got symbolic, warm words about universal principles without a set of actions. So that let's have those discussions. Secondly, kind of observation from where we are in that kind of space of unity is life outside the UK, outside the European Union, in terms of this foreign policy challenge. I mean, for us, it's the proposition or position where we are more on the forward-leaning side of the spectrum. There's many others in Poland and the Baltic states who wouldn't be surprised at that. Where a degree of risk given that. I noticed the Kremlin said yesterday that the UK was the most bellicose in terms of criticism of Russia, part of the picture. But also simultaneously, if the things we have been advocating for are to take genuine effect, we need the heft of the United States, we need the heft of the European Union. So, as Justin pointed in terms of breadth of sanctions processes. So, we're learning to kind of adapt to those different versions of propositions of unity as well. So it needn't be sort of, just a version of the sort of common NATO statements that came out yesterday. Unity requires not a sort of increase in resources, which is something again we've been arguing for many years, and it's good to see happening. It's also about willingness to accept political risk, willingness to invest, depth of political time, and you can see this every single day in this building. This sort of the trade-off issue with in terms of cost of living, gas prices, and things like that. It's how far willing to go for that as well. But again, and then there's something even simpler than that, which is this is a pretty significant historical moment, and I think if we learned anything over the last 10 years, vis-a-vis red lines or frankly the failure of the Western security paradigm in Afghanistan, Iraq, take it through to Libya, these sort of periodic events we used to have on intervention, is that those historical moments, so those red lines, passing or going, actually do really matter, and lessons are taken from those who want to push those edges. So you're in a situation today in which 10 million people have been displaced. 10 million people have been displaced in a European country by a war of aggression against a democratically elected government. It is remarkable, and we should not and cannot simply be talking about mitigation and the mitigation of the effects of that, because the implications of allowing that to happen, I think they do have profound echoes in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. So it is a real kind of serious challenge for it. One has to think about in terms of the theatre of the historical moment, because I'm afraid we can try and talk about this in technical mitigation terms. We've got to get on with things like food security. We've got to think more effectively about sanctions regime. But it's not kind of, it's not the G7 conversations of old, I think, where, there are technical multilateral answers to these problems. It is a question of will and defense of certain fundamental principles. And I think that's how, future historians will look at it. And even if we don't, afraid we can't sort of solve this problem technically, because that is how those who would test the boundaries further are viewing it as well, as a pretty gruesome moment of historical political theatre as well.
Thank you, John. Mina, did you want to jump in here?
I did. Just to make an observation, that I think is sort of implicitly running through a lot of this. But that is, of course, as John has just alluded to, the fact that number one, lessons are going to be learned out of this horrific war as well, that will determine a lot about the next decade for all of us and for the world as a whole. Of course, I'm thinking there of the lessons that the PRC might take from the conflict in Ukraine and our responses to it for Taiwan, although Taiwan is a very different case and the parallels in many ways are tenuous. But this is a place where I think the lessons that the PRC takes, not just this month, but 6 months from now and 12 months from now are going to be critically important in shaping the geopolitics of the future. And not just the long-term future 10 years out, but the future 3 and 4 years out. But another observation that I just wanted to share on this question of unity is to flip it back to the Russia-China question quickly, which is to say, I agree entirely with John that wedge driving is much easier said than done. But I nonetheless also think that it's important to keep in mind that we're unlikely, I think, to see a fully and publicly unified Moscow and Beijing in which China is totally comfortable being saddled with the burden of Vladimir Putin's brutal and ill-begotten war. That is to say, I think we're likely to see a Sino-Russian relationship that's a little bit more complicated than something like a moniker like Axis of Authoritarians would allow us to believe. And that is to say that we are likely to continue to see some amount of Chinese support for the Russian economy, but a dance that Beijing tries to do to keep up its economic ties to the European European Union in particular, but also to the United States, and a dance in which it tries to publicly realign itself with its long-held positions in favor of independence and territorial integrity and sovereignty, which of course is laughable given what has just unfolded in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But this is all to say that I think if we tell ourselves that we've entered a moment in which we're talking about kind of our alliance systems against a solidified bloc that constitutes Russia and China, we've oversimplified the picture that is playing out here. And indeed, that more complicated dance between Russia and China is more complicated for us to respond to.
Thanks very much, Mira. And I want to bring in some questions. There's already a chat happening that was prompted by Hal. Professor, I think somebody had a question. Nakayama, did you still want to come in? I saw you had your hand up. Thanks for your patience.
Do we still have time?
We do have time. Go right ahead.
Okay. Just briefly, great discussion. Just one question to Mira. And I hope my friends at Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not watching because I'm going to get in trouble. And this might not be the kind of question that you should ask in the public setting, but anyhow. And Japan this time around was almost totally on board on sanctions, right? Maybe like 12 hours late, but we were totally on board. But Japan is known to have an independent or slightly different Russian policy. So was there a concern about it? Your ambassador, Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, did tweet on the day of the Northern Territory and said that he is totally on board with Japan on the issue. And some did sense a subtle message there. So was there like a talk within the team about Japan's independent or slightly different Russian policy? As a result, we ended up totally on board, so we didn't have to worry about it today. But was there sort of a concern? So that's my question.
Thank you. And Mira, hold your thought for just a second. I want to bring Hal in because I think this is a conversation happening between Hal and Justin already. Hal, do you want to just pose your question verbally so that everyone can hear it?
Sure. So the question was what the current crisis teaches us about the strength or weakness of our respective defense industrial bases. So basically, what does it show about our ability or lack thereof to sustain production of key munitions and systems in a protracted, high-intensity fight with either Russia or China? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hal. So Mira, let me go over to you to address Professor Nakayama's question.
Yep, great to see you, Professor, and thanks for a great question. Look, the Northern Territories issue as a central consideration for Japan is, of course, well known to us, and we did assume that Japan's concern over the Northern Territories would factor into its response to Russia somewhat. Although we didn't have a particularly concretized view of what that would mean, particularly because, of course, Prime Minister Kishida is both relatively new to office as Prime Minister, but also has extraordinary foreign policy experience as a former foreign minister. So we knew that he would make a careful set of decisions, but didn't know exactly where he would come out on this issue. That said, the Japanese response and Prime Minister Kishida's personal response to Russia's invasion have both been swifter, far broader, and frankly, just more steely in general than we really could have imagined. Prime Minister Kishida's support for sanctions, for export controls, just for a broad range of measures have been fairly unflappable. And I think that Japan's leadership on this set of issues have helped to lead other Indo-Pacific partners to similar places. Obviously, that Indo-Pacific unity, as we've been saying across the board with respect to all alliance unity, is something we're going to have to work hard to keep up over time. But for now, we certainly don't see Japan's territorial issues as having caused the slightest issue for Japan's response. Quite to the contrary, we've been delighted to the upside. I'll chime in very quickly on Hal's question, just to say that when it comes to our defense industrial bases, I think that both the United States and other allies and partners need to be thinking seriously about what we can do through our own industrial supply chains to offer sustainable solutions to countries that may now be considering how to replace their dependence on Russian defense systems. We have a number of partners that have chosen to keep their chips in with Russia in terms of their defense procurement, in part as a hedge against China, but who are now in a place of reconsidering the wisdom of those decisions. And not only will they need to make long-term decisions about how to potentially replace Russian systems, in the immediate term, they will need to be able to get supplies and spare parts to be able to maintain their own militaries. So one near-term agenda item that we should all be working on together is third-party substitution in those supply chains.
Thank you, Mira. And Justin, do you want to respond to Mira's comment that Hal put out there about our ability to resupply on a consistent basis, an active war that may drag on for a very long time?
Obviously, the shock that was the invasion of Ukraine led to a focus on the actual war-fighting capabilities. It was particularly true in Germany, just next door from here, where actually the defense budget is not very different from the French one. It's on a par with the French one, but the fighting capabilities are not comparable to that of the French armed forces, not only because of lack of, I would say, use and training, but also for lack of attention to operational capabilities. And I think that's a reawakening, I guess, of the defense spirit in Europe. I think progress will be made on the EU side, but individually countries will pay attention to that. I know it's the case for the French Ministry of Defense, because even though we have a full spectrum armed forces, there are some holes in the ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. Now, if you allow me, if we take just a step back, obviously, it's not the world we wanted to get in, right? I mean, we see defense budget increase considerably over the past few years, and it's going to be even worse in the coming years. And obviously, if that is indeed a priority and that's sort of forced upon us, there's also a case to be made that we'll need other resources, either to prevent countries from the global south to suffer from the disruptions that I mentioned earlier, or simply for global cooperation. I mean, all the problems that we were talking before the invasion of Ukraine remain here. So now we're focusing on resupply of munitions, and that's right, we should do this, but we should not forget the rest of the agenda, because the sort of the fight on the bridge of the Titanic will not make the iceberg go away, right? And so that's one of the concerns that we have. We should be able to do the two things at the same time, but it's going to be difficult.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, as you mentioned, there was an article I think out just yesterday from the Polish foreign minister that suggested some concrete steps towards maintaining a continuous supply of weapons. That I thought was useful. It wasn't as specific as I would have liked to see, but it did mention some specifics, lessons learned from, especially how the U.S. stepped in after the Second World War with the Lend-Lease program in particular. So there's definitely models that we have if we need to do more to develop our industrial capabilities in the military domain. I want to just bring in Professor Calder here because he's posed a question in the chat that I think is really critical, and then I'll come to you, John, if you don't mind, to address it. Professor Calder, go ahead.
Thanks, Alina. Of course, throughout the discussion here, we have heard a lot about the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and certainly I agree with that, and aligning the concerns of the West and the Indo-Pacific. But of course, India itself, right at the core of the Indo-Pacific, has remained decidedly neutral at the United Nations. Reports of implementing a rupee agreement to finance direct trade, which would directly undermine sanctions. I wonder if the panel had any comments on how India might be encouraged to be more consistent with other members of both the Indo-Pacific and NATO.
An absolutely critical question. Thank you so much, Kent. John, let me start with you, if you don't mind, and then we'll go backwards to Justin and Mira. So since we only have about 5 minutes left, please use this opportunity to make any final comments, things do you want to put on the table that you haven't yet. And John, over to you.
The reason I was late for this call is I've been discussing the issue that Professor Calder brought up. I'll just say I'm particularly interested to hear Mira's response on this one to put the ball in her court. Look, it's something we're thinking about. First thing to say is, I mean, you know, to the points just in the previous part of the discussion, and particularly Japan's role, the G7's been really quite effective and functioning. If one was telling an optimistic story, if you go back to Carver Spain, the statement made at Carver Spain and around the G7 on authoritarianism, on democratic values. If you remember at that moment in time, the UK's 3 guests to the G7 were Australia, South Korea, and India. The proposition being that, complicated as some of those cross-cutting relationships were, that basically those G7 countries had a decreasing share of global GDP, and therefore the familiar groupings that we had to think more systematically and effectively about them. And I think that proposition still stands, to be honest with you. I'd say the G7 actually has been really quite effective in terms of sanctions. My kind of plea or my proposition is that sanctions have been put on by G7 and therefore had a heft to them. I think that the UK view is therefore, if there's ever a world in which sanctions are taken off, they should be taken off with the G7 as well. So I think that collaboration is important. And again, within that, there's lots of different multilateral groupings. I mean, obviously because of Five Eyes, etc., UK and US analysis or predictions in terms of likely, what was likely on the ground, etc., were more naturally aligned. But again, there's a whole question over intelligence sharing, I think, in this period of time, and I know there's been lots of commentary in the US about that as well. So those kind of multilateral groupings are actually quite interesting to watch in terms of the sort of changing structures of order. And then there's the moment we have yesterday with NATO, etc., where, as I say, despite the sort of slight differences of position, that unity was impressive, and it is a message to take out of it. Secondly, on Hal's question, so I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I know it's vivid. And Justin mentioned the Titanic, which of course is built in Belfast and sailed down from Belfast. The other thing that's been built in Belfast at the moment are the NLAWs, which have become a significant part of the anti-tank weaponry of the UK's contribution. I believe the Swedish parts, French company, Thales, made in Belfast and Northern Ireland, transferred across to Ukraine. And all I can say is, to Hal's question, as I speak, people around me are discussing precisely that question, which is a supply chain question. It's more pertinent because the types of munitions sent into the battlefield, I think, are far more effective than perhaps some people presumed at the outset. So that it's more of a profound question. So that's the immediate tactical questions in terms of defensive weaponry. And then the second element of that, which I think is far more significant, and I think back to being involved in the NATO reflections process last year, where some of this was hinted at but not grappled with, is that you've got in this broader community of democracies, and again, I think Japan has a really significant role to play in this in terms of its own capabilities on technology, future combat air, commitments it's made on defense spending. It's basically you've got these within this broader community, you've got these different military industrial complexes, to be absolutely frank, and the interaction of them, I think, is just as significant as President Scholz's announcement on the increase in defense spending is where that money is spent, and how, for example, Franco-German defense cooperation looks like, whether Germany buys off the shelf when it comes to F-35s. Those are major strategic questions, and I don't think actually we fully grasp the significance of them if we were to maintain that different united proposition. It's a challenge for the United States as well. There's a certain wariness of the kind of the heft and the size and the rapaciousness of the American industrial military machine, or in the UK when there's to be frank, a wariness about an EU industrial military pillar within NATO and what that means for the UK as well. So those are things we're going to have to thrash out. I don't think the market alone can do it for us. I'll end there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, John. And we're about 1 minute out from our hard stop. We'll just start a couple of minutes late. So if Justin, Mira, you have maybe 5 minutes left to just make some final comments and address the India question as well. Justin, 2 minutes.
Sure, absolutely. No, I'll be brief, even though the issue I want to tackle is large. It's obviously, as Larry Fink has remarked, it's another blow to globalization. Obviously, or as Fyodor Lukyanov recently said, you are running a giant experiment on us, speaking of Russia, that is unplugging a country, a G20 economy from the world economy, is something that we've never done before, right? And even if there are specificities of the Russian economy that perhaps facilitate what's going on, it's still we're very much in unknown territory. But then it was added, and we're running a giant experiment on us. Speaking of Putin and the Russian people who will also suffer. So my line of thought is the world that we're going to live in after Ukraine, and I'm not saying after the war because we don't know, as you mentioned, when it will end, but rather after the beginning of the invasion and the blow of sanctions, is one in which it's not the economy stupid that prevails in terms of decisions, in terms of localization of supply chains and production, but rather geopolitical considerations, political considerations. Just look at how much large global companies have been forced to take into consideration the political context in which they operated, whether to should I stay or should I go in Russia. And so this will create a very different world in which there are many unknown points, but that's the I'll end on one thought, which is that it's often said that trade can promote peace, but we know it's the other way around, actually, right? It's peace that favors trade, and we had this long period of globalization in the 19th century up until 1914, which was facilitated by the fact that there was stability, geopolitical stability. There were a couple of wars, but by and large, the world opened up because of peace. That ended between the two world wars, and that didn't come up until the 1970s. But then we had this blossoming of globalization between the 1980s and now, and I think this period is coming to an end, and we live in a very different world, and probably one that is not richer, to say the least, and that will also include a lot of suffering, including for global South countries.
Thank you, Justin. Mira, you have the last word.
Thanks, Alina. I will take the question about India from Professor Calder. I think we would certainly all acknowledge and agree that when it comes to votes at the UN, India's position on the current crisis has been unsatisfactory, to say the least, but it's also been totally unsurprising. And I think we have to put it in the context of India's sort of recent grand strategic history when we think about what might come next. If we look back at India's sort of strategic culture 10 years ago, Delhi was still almost exclusively non-aligned in the way that it thought about its foreign policy, kind of inching its way closer to the United States, certainly to France, countries like Israel, but this was a totally incremental process in which our Indian friends were pretty jealously guarding their foreign policy independence and non-aligned status. But that changed radically with China's aggression at the line of actual control in 2020 and has completely transformed the way that Indian friends think about their foreign policy and alignment going forward, and has radically changed, at the core, the way that India thinks about China. But as a result, Delhi has cleaved in many ways more closely to its relationship with Russia, because without that relationship with Russia, it would lose the final remaining hedge against being aligned almost entirely with the United States and with European countries. Russia was the only remaining alternative once China was out of the picture and fully identified as a threat and a challenger, and no longer as a partner. So India finds itself in an incredibly difficult position right now. And I think we can acknowledge its public position as being problematic while also understanding fully that our colleagues in Delhi understand where they are. They fundamentally understand the same alignments between Moscow and Beijing that we are seeing right now. Frankly, they're also concerned about the role that Pakistan plays in the relationship with Russia and China. And they're thinking long and hard about their defense dependency on Russia and how to position themselves, given what Russia has proven itself to be on the international stage and the support that it has from Beijing. So I think our perspective would be that the the way forward involves keeping India close, thinking hard about how to present it with options so that it can continue to provide for its strategic autonomy, which is fundamentally a part of its foreign policy identity, even as it reckons with and responds to the undeniable changes that we've seen taking place just in the last month. I'll just wrap up by noting that while many of those changes seem like they've been thrust upon us in this moment of strategic shock, as John rightly identified in the last 4 or 6 weeks, some of the opportunities that we see in terms of changes in a position like India's or other partners may take months, if not years, to fully come to fruition. So I hope we can continue conversations like this one as those dynamics continue to unfold.
Wow, Mira, that was an incredible note for us to close on. Thank you so much. I knew that we would have a lot more to discuss. I feel like we're just getting into some of these really core issues. I really appreciate all of you taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy and doing things that we all want you to be doing and spending most of your time on. So Mira, thank you so much. John, Justin, I had a really easy job here with all of you, and thanks to everyone in the audience for asking such good questions to get the conversation moving in all kinds of different directions. I learned a lot from this discussion, and certainly this isn't going to be the last time we have this conversation. We're just at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, as we all acknowledge, and I think the ramifications and the consequences will make themselves known in the medium and long term. I just hope that we can maintain that kind of unity we all started this conversation off with, again, to ensure that we are all working together with the same goals in mind. But I think the question now is, what are those goals, right? What are those broad strategic goals that we should be aligning on? So thanks again, everyone. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Gavin to take this conversation, this conference into the next dimension, if you will. Frank, over to you.
Well, thank you, Alina.
Thank you, Alina.
Thank you for what an extraordinary conversation, extraordinary discussion, and fulfilling my earlier description of this group as the Marvel movie version of the Justice League. Thank you. Really, truly extraordinary discussion of grand strategy in the future. That ends this morning's panel. We will be gathering again at 6:30 for the final 2 panels of our conference. And I look forward to seeing you all there later this evening. So thank you again. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists, John, Justin, Mira, and Alina, for just an extraordinary conversation. And I will see everyone at 6:30. Thank you.